I don't know anyone that would want to do that, pulling a wagon across it. I mean, it's just nothing for miles. And after the first 2 miles, I was like, I'm done. I can't believe you did it with wagons, and they had to pull them out of the sand because like it would sink, and I would have left. I would have been done. I'm surprised Hastings didn't get murdered when they showed up to California. It's crazy. There's nothing to look at. It's endless.
You traveled as you could in the day. You made what progress you could at night until it was over, until you reached that spring, which was to reach life again. They had expected something that was maybe 40 miles when they were first sold this bill of goods up in Fort Bridger. As they got out here and discovered what they were really into, it was life-threatening.
Some of the most barren country in the whole United States, aptly described by John C. Fremont in his journals, and then Stansberry in his journals, as a vast plain without even a blade of grass. Searing heat with many mirages as you look out over the desert.
Well, the Hastings Cutoff was a good idea on paper and a bad idea on the landscape, because of this area here that surrounds us. It was initially billed, as being both quicker and shorter than the traditional route that ran up to Fort Hall and then hooked into the Humboldt River. But it was really not short, and it was extremely difficult.
Very deceptive. A hard crust on the surface that once you break through, bottomless mud. Capable of swallowing animals and wagons. Very treacherous.
We were able to see the Cedar Mountains, and then out into the Grease Woods, and then across the Salt Flats. And it just gives some perspective of what all they faced. It wasn't just a trail with no water. It was a vast open plain of mud flats in all directions. You were just in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing out here, and I think that's an important perspective to keep for generations, so they understand what they faced when they came across this.
The way I see it, that people just had to drive to get west, westward expansion and land, and to be able to farm much better than they would in the Midwest.
I mean, some days I come out here and you don't see a single person the entire time you're out here, and sometimes it almost kind of feels like the end of the earth. It really does. It's a neat place for me. For several years now, I've been in charge for our field office of the California Trail, and particularly the Hastings Cutoff route. And it's been a real privilege to get to know the trail and understand what it was all about, and read the journals and find out about all the drama that occurred out here, and some of the human tragedies and suffering that people went through when they were trying to traverse the largest waterless section of any immigrant trail that we have in the United States.
So most of these people that came, those first 4 parties were not poor people. They were farmers. They were able to supply their own way.
Probably the wealthiest party to cross that year. They had more belongings. They had a bigger wagon, more wagons. They moved slower. The 3 parties ahead of them made it through with little trouble. I think they were better adept at covering the territory, more tried, understood the hardships a little more. I don't think the Donners and the Reeds and the people in the party were really aware of what they were getting into. Until they were so far into it, there was no turning back.
Hastings was a dreamer. His idea was to build the population of California, and so that he could become kind of the king, you know, the ruler of this community that he was trying to build. And that's why, my opinion is, why he wanted people to go to California, his route.
There were some folks who were warning people, don't take that trail. But for various reasons, folks chose to take it anyway.
One of my observations was about Skull Valley and the country west of here is it's pretty much the same as it was 160 years ago when all this happened. It hasn't changed.
And a beautiful description of Redland Springs, because it was nothing but just a mud or sand that they could dig in and get the water. And it's, according to some descriptions, it wasn't very good water. It was salty, and actually there was some grass there they would cut, because this was really the last water before they got to the salt flat.
These folks had anticipated a difficult time. They'd stocked up on their grass that they'd cut to feed their animals and put up what water in their containers they could. Unfortunately, they had been told that the dry spell would be much shorter than it really was. It was actually about twice as long or a little more than they were anticipating.
There could be rattlesnakes and scorpions, maybe. And never encountered this kind of heat before, so.
There's a tarantula.
Don't.
So we're here at the last watering hole before a long stretch of trail, and I'm interested to see how far these people went before they got water again. I'm curious to see the landscape and just exactly what they experienced. Should be exciting to see what they had to cross before they got to fill their bellies again with cold water.
So you want us to come down near the road with you guys?
The first section we went through the Cedar Mountains and hiked about 3 or 4 miles into our first camp. It was a pretty nice hike, pretty scenic, lots of cheatgrass, which wasn't very fun, but the first day I felt pretty good, had a lot of energy, and it was pretty easy. So along the trail they have some T-rail markers. They also have some white carcinite markers that kind of mark out the trail where it went. So while we were hiking across the trail, we looked for those markers. It's like 8 o'clock at night, it's still 95 degrees.
My stomach's growling. I can't imagine doing this without water. I'm like halfway done with Camelback right now. Never a dull moment. Going into this, I thought I was going to run into a rattlesnake, which I did. Thought I was going to run into scorpions, which luckily I didn't.
I suspect that they've had the same feeling when they came out here, being able to see so far and taking so long to get here. They probably underestimated their distance. What guided the people crossing this was Pilot Peak. That's all they could see. They knew that's where they had to go, and so they were just watching that peak to get them there. And we kept our eye on it as well the whole time, just to keep that in perspective of where we were headed.
Bandana. A map.
Like, it's really hot. I am winning the Ugly Hat Award. Yes!
It's the Wild Wild West. I've seen the movies, I've read books about the Wild West. I've never really had a Wild West experience where you look across this vast landscape and you see nobody. There's no signs of human life. Not much signs of life at all, actually.
It's one thing to read about it, but when you come out here you realize how far and hot and just what exactly they experienced. It's an eye-opener. I think all the physical things like the sun and the vast just nothingness are hard, but I think it's more mental would be the hardest thing. I think it's just that feeling of not, you're walking and not getting to any end. These few days we've been out here, you come over one mountaintop and just see a big open flat valley. And then you have to realize you have to cross that before you can get to water. And it's just one after the other. So that would have been very discouraging.
There's a little bit of wildlife out here, but yeah,
And the guys ran into some issues with cheatgrass.
lots of cheatgrass covered in it.
They're covered in it. It's just long and hot.
Yeah.
Long and hot.
Now we're going on to the mud flats.
Crossing this salt flats was the difficult, crucible experience of the Donner Reed party. One of the ways of coping and dealing with the situation was you'd loosen your animals and just attempt to drive them to water, to walk them to water. Some of the animals would become crazed with the heat and the thirst and just run away and break.
But for the biggest part, that's what they just kept going. It was just nonstop. The animals went crazy. Water.
To stop on the salt flats essentially meant death. You had to get across. This one is not only long and dry, 80 to 90 miles, but it can be so damp, so muddy, you can't even get a horse through it. The reason they were so late has a great deal to do with what happened right out here next to us. How they had difficulty crossing this extensive dry stretch of frequently soft and sometimes firm ground.
Look at that. I almost fell on my head. Woohoo! There we are. Hannah, say hi. Hello. Goggle girl. There's our fearless GPS operator. Here's our green light drinker. And here's the guy who almost fell on his head tripping on the marker in the middle of the night. It's the Hastings Cutoff trail marker. Woohoo!
Mostly you had to traverse this long valley, and then you got up to the point of Donner Pass, a high spot in the island complex. Well, you got to Donner Pass, and then you could see another, what we now consider to be kind of a beautiful section of salt playa, but it was another 10 or so miles of difficult trail before you got to the foot of Pilot Peak and that all-important Donner Spring water.
This is the stretch behind me. This is where everything went very, very bad for people. This is where the livestock started breaking down. This is where people started breaking down. This is where wagons were abandoned. People were left on the side of the trail, speechless from total dehydration. And it's also the location where there were some dramatic rescues. People actually went 90 miles without water, got to Donner Spring, and then had the courage to turn themselves around and carry water back out to the mud flats and rescue people who were stuck with abandoned wagons or who were just laying there by the side of the road.
And they'd probably never been on a salt flats before. The sun beats down on you, and it's like being on an ice field. The glare comes up at you from the ground. It's hot. It's very bright. And as they began to run out of water, things got desperate. And if you couldn't cross, somebody had to come back and rescue you.
And I think one of the most incredible, dramatic stories that's found in any of the emigrant journals is an eyewitness here at Donner Spring who witnessed an elderly woman carrying a coffee pot full of water back out onto the salt flats to rescue her husband who had collapsed and could no longer continue. And to me, that story is a microcosm of the courage and determination that the people who built this country and traveled these immigrant trails had.
The sun and the heat was my biggest challenge. I come into this experience having been a backpacking guide before. So I'm very familiar with hiking long distances, being on my feet all day. But dealing with the constant sunlight, the heat, and just the basic dryness and exposure to that, that was a big challenge for me.
Out to find a shrub.
Yeah!
I'm pretty tired, pretty sore. It's hot, and we've been hiking for about 2 hours, and so I'm pretty tired.
I just have to say that my hat's off to them. I'm just massively impressed with what they were able to accomplish and endure out here. Just take on the challenge so fully and really embrace it.
It was pretty fun to come out here with a bunch of friends that we didn't really know each other very well, and until we got out here and spent a lot of time together, we were able to talk a lot and get to know each other really well. We had some really fun times, some really interesting conversations, things late at night on the night hike when we were all pretty tired and delirious. So there was some fun times as well.
Well, you know, the National Trail System Act specifically identifies the protection of these resources for a vicarious experience. And as I have been in trail administration, I pondered the word vicarious. And what does that mean? Well, the Hastings Cutoff is the epitome of vicarious. And what we just went and did was a true immersion into one of the most arduous, if not the most arduous, section of Western Migration Trail. And having these youth interns come out and do this and see their eyes open, and especially as I told them, no, we're going to go out in the middle of the salt flats and heat and experience what these immigrants faced. But as they got out and did it, they really came to life. Some of my favorite memories from this adventure were walking with them out in the middle of playas and greasewood. And that's what these trails can do for us. They can get us out into the outdoors and into our history and bring things to life.
We're essentially the new generation, and by having this initial exposure at such a young age and having this experience as a whole makes us more aware of how important it is to maintain these historical trails and really have respect for the ones who came before us and try to protect that.
And it passed into this wonderful little niche in history where we have a tremendous human saga occurring right here. It was brief, but it was noteworthy. And I think those kinds of lessons are still important to our own day and age. Let the buyer beware. Be careful of what you get into. Be careful of who you take counsel from.
When they got to Pilot Springs, the second or third day they were there, they woke up to find a dusting of snow on the hills. That had to have been ominous, to realize that you're late enough in the season that just barely across the desert, have 600-800 miles left to go, and there's snow in the mountains. It had to be an ominous omen.